On the morning of the 21st of November 1920, Michael Collins sent out a large unit of IRA men consisting of the Dublin Brigade, the Dublin ASU and the squad in order to execute and assassinate a number of spies and different British and intelligence military targets across Dublin. Most of this occurred in South Dublin, in the South Dublin area and along O'Connell Street. Now during the early morning attacks, 13 targets were killed and one civilian. Of those, I've been able to find the graves of four of the targets who were buried in Dublin.
So there was a man named Fitzgerald, or Fitzmaurice, I've forgotten which. I met him in the castle. He had only one arm. I met him in the castle that day, Saturday. And my job was poking around to see who these fellas were. So I was talking to 3 or 4 more fellas, and I got talking with them. I knew some of them, Englishmen. So I said to your man who was an Irishman, what are you doing here? Oh, it's the same in the run from the IRA up from Clare. Where are you staying now? Says I. I'm staying at 28 of Pembroke Street. I knew that place was a haunt of secret servicemen. He was shot.
This is the grave of Captain John Fitzgerald, an Irish-born target of Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November 1920. He was from Tipperary and he was aged only 22 years old when he was killed. And he was killed on 28 Earlsford Terrace. So it's believed that he was maybe mistaken for a different spy with a similar name, Clement Fitzpatrick, who actually left Ireland just after Bloody Sunday. But John Fitzgerald was a veteran of World War I and he was actually a fighter pilot. He was shot down, I think he was shot down once and managed to escape, and eventually he returned to Ireland and joined the RIC in County Clare, and he was shot during an ambush 1 or 2 months before November 1920, and he left and moved to Dublin, or was recuperating in Dublin, but he was then targeted and killed on the morning of Bloody Sunday along with a number of other spies and soldiers across Dublin. So that's the grave of John Fitzgerald, and he's buried here in Glasnevin Cemetery, just overlooking O'Connell Tower. I think it was Donald MacLean. He was a former Scottish soldier who was recruited as an intelligence officer, and he was captured in County Clare and given an opportunity to leave Ireland, and he was given 5 days to leave by the East Clare IRA. But when they found that he hadn't left, they passed on his information to Michael Collins, and he was in Dublin at the time of Bloody Sunday, and he was executed in 117 Moorhampton Road. This is the grave of Donald, I believe it's Donald MacLean. Yeah, Donald MacLean. Now it was in Listonvarna that he was captured by the Clare IRA, and he was actually executed along with a civilian, Thomas Smith, whose grave I will hopefully have in a portion of this video. So this is in the Grangegorm Military Cemetery. You'll see from the other videos that only of the 4 men I did find, only 2 of them actually have headstones. The other 2 were possibly civilians, but their information will be in the other video. But that's Donald MacLean, and he is here towards the entrance to Grangegorm Military Cemetery, along with men who would have died in the 1916 Easter Rising and others killed during the War of Independence. But that's Donald MacLean. A civilian who was killed by the IRA on the morning of Bloody Sunday was, I think it's Thomas Herbert Smith. Now I've located where his graveyard is in Drumcondra, but it's behind, like, it's a lot of work to get into it. So, and I believe he's buried in an unmarked grave, but he was killed he was killed alongside Donald MacLean. And I forgot to add a little bit, Donald MacLean, he was actually living with his family at the time, so he was living with his wife and children, and he asked not to be shot in front of them, to be taken away. So I just thought that last little piece of information. But Thomas Herbert Smith was his landlord, and he was a civilian, probably killed maybe getting in the way, or just believed that he was a target also. But there are just a few of the other targets of Bloody Sunday. After a little while of searching, I have come across the unmarked grave of Patrick Francis McCormack. He was a native of Mayo, I believe, and he was shot and killed on the morning of Bloody Sunday, 21st November 1920, in the Gresham Hotel, in the mistaken belief that he was a spy. He was a veterinary surgeon working with the horses of the British cavalry, but he wasn't a spy or operating in any way against the IRA or Sinn Féin, and it's believed that he was actually a nationalist. And his mother, Kate McCormack, she wrote to the Minister of Defence, Richard Mulcahy, protesting his killing, and Michael Collins actually replied in a kind of an apology, saying there was no particular charge against him except that he was an enemy soldier. So I think she took up the fact that he was being marked as a spy or maybe a traitor against his own people, whereas he wasn't. So, well, in that regard, he wasn't actually a spy working against his own people. But this is the unmarked grave of Patrick Francis McCormack, who is actually from Castlebar, he is buried here in Glasnevin Cemetery. So this is yet another unmarked grave of a target of Bloody Sunday 1920, and this is the grave of Lieutenant Leonard Aidan Wilde. He was the second man shot in Gresham Hotel, so along with McCormack. And newly released information proves, or at least validates, that he was a British intelligence officer, posing as a commercial traveller. He appears to have lived in Cuba, Spain and France, and according to his assassin James Cahill, he answered the door to the hotel declaring himself to be Alan Wilde, British intelligence officer, just back from Spain. So he obviously thought whoever was coming into the building was other British Army officers, but he was killed in the Gresham Hotel on Bloody Sunday, August 1922. And I believe he is the last of the official targets that I can find, and he's buried in St. Paul's Cemetery in Glasnevin. There you go. Later that evening, Croke Park was attacked by the auxiliaries and Black and Tans, and 14 people were killed, and I've included some of their deaths. And then later that night and following Bloody Sunday, there were a few more executions and deaths in Dublin Castle, and as many of those as I can will be included here. So these are the stories and the graves of Bloody Sunday, 21st of November 1920.
When the shooting started, I looked back and all the crowd were rushing around inside the canal gate. I saw Mick Hogan and a Dublin player coming running in my direction. So I turned and ran down the field then.
Yes.
There was a Dublin player running in front of me. I followed him.
Yes. And were you aware that bullets were flying around?
Oh, yeah, you could hear the bullets whizzing.
Jane Boyle has the unenviable position of being the only female to die on Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November 1920, and she was also set to be married the week after she was killed, but she was killed in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday, and she was later buried in her wedding dress. And this is her grave here in Glasnevin Cemetery. So this, along with most of the other, I think all of the other victims of Bloody Sunday, were commemorated a couple of years ago by the GAA, and from what I heard was actually Jane Boyle's distant relatives came to visit her grave from America and found out that there was no headstone, so they got in contact with the GAA and helped set up the memorials for the victims of Bloody Sunday. But this is Jane Boyle, and who was shot and killed in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday, 21st November 1920, aged 28 years old. So this lady was buried in her wedding dress because she never actually made it to her wedding. But that's Jane Boyle. This is the grave of Michael Feary. So he was another man that was killed in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday. So Michael Feary was from Gardner Place, and he was shot by the same army he fought for in World War One. He was a veteran of the First World War. And his body lay in the morgue unclaimed for 5 days. He'd been out of work since returning from the war, and a doctor who examined his body after shooting stated he was badly nourished and was missing a number of teeth. So he was buried in a mass grave, so a lot of the people were buried in a mass grave, which would have been over here. So it's most likely that this isn't actually his final resting place, but this is where he is buried now. So it was erected by the Feary family with the assistance of the Gaelic Athletic Association. So I do believe there was people that came over either from abroad or maybe even from Dublin, but they were buried here. And this is Michael Feary, buried in St. Paul's Cemetery also in Glasnevin. So this is the grave of Jerome O'Leary, who was the youngest person killed on Bloody Sunday at only 10 years old. So he'd been lifted onto the wall at the back of the canal end to get a better view of the football match when he was shot and killed. And he was the son of a former British soldier, someone who'd survived World War I. And although his son was killed, or although his son was killed by British force, Jerome Sr. was shot by the IRA as a suspected spy, and him and his family had to flee Dublin in 1921. And his son's grave was left unmarked until the GAA's Bloody Sunday Graves project was enacted. And this is his grave. So most of the people would have been very poor and would have been left in unmarked graves. So like a lot of the graves around here are unmarked. So that is the grave of Jerome O'Leary. Now I'm taking a lot of this information from the Irish Times website, so thank you for that information. Located here in the very uniquely located Bluebell Cemetery near Inchicore in County Dublin is the grave of Joseph Traynor. He was a member of the IRA during the War of Independence, and he was also a victim on Bloody Sunday in Croke Park. So he wasn't involved in the actions on Bloody Sunday morning, but he had heard, supposedly he'd heard of the events. But him and a friend went to watch the match in Dublin, and he was shot and killed when the British Army invaded the pitch on 21st November 1920. So it reads here, Joseph Patrick Traynor, 1900 to 1920, shot dead Bloody Sunday, Croke Park, 21st November 1920. And it's also the grave of his parents. And here you actually have a little image of him. It says, oh yeah, and that was it as well. He was the captain of the young Emirates team. And this is obviously a little picture of him. But that is Joe Traynor, a member of the IRA and also a victim of Bloody Sunday. Patrick O'Dowd was another victim of Bloody Sunday, 21st of November 1920. I keep saying August for some reason. But he was killed helping people escape Croke Park. So he was helping people over the wall when he was shot and killed. And he was a builder's labourer who'd just gone out to watch the match. But this is his headstone here. Patrick O'Dowd, Buckingham Buildings, Dublin. Loving husband and devoted father, shot and killed in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday, November 21st, 1920. And he was survived by a wife and 2 children, but he was helping people escape from Croke Park. And this is St. Paul's Cemetery. So there are a couple of other people whose headstones whose headstones are here, but just to the fact of the size of the graveyard, I won't be able to get to them all. But they were all civilians who were killed during Bloody Sunday. There was also obviously Michael Hogan, who the Hogan stand's named after, and a man from Limerick, and I believe another man from Tipperary, whose graves I won't be able to make because it's too far to include in the video. But they were the civilians killed in Croke Park during Bloody Sunday, and I'll probably try and put a list of the names of the civilian victims here somewhere in the video. But that was Patrick O'Dowd, one of the civilians and a hero of Bloody Sunday, November 1920.
That's what happened in the case of Dick McKee and Paddy Clancy, on the eve of Bloody Sunday. They were arrested in their own houses and they were brought to Dublin Castle. And we didn't know where they were. Couldn't find out, even through our agents. Because what happened there, they were brought into the auxiliary headquarters and they found out who they were on the Sunday and they just murdered them. They were brutally murdered in Dublin Castle.
Following the assassinations in the morning of Bloody Sunday and the attack on Croke Park, 2 of Michael Collins' key men and an innocent man, Conor Clune, were arrested and tortured and killed by F Company of the Auxiliaries in Dublin Castle in their headquarters. So these two men were Peadar Clancy and Richard Dick McKee. Dick McKee was a founder of the squad, and Peadar Clancy worked with Michael Collins in organising Bloody Sunday. And Peadar Clancy also owned the shop in which Sean Tracy was killed on Talbot Street. But these two men, along with Conor Clune, were tortured and killed by the auxiliaries, and they would have been the last three men to die on the evening of Bloody Sunday. But they were given up by an informant who was later tracked down and executed by the IRA. Shankers Ryan, I believe his name was. But this is Peadar Clancy and Richard McKee. Conor Clune, I believe, is buried in Tipperary. I think that's where he was from. I might have got that wrong, but this is the grave of Peadar Clancy and Richard McKee. Now, the last two men to die in connection to Bloody Sunday in November 1920 were Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan, and they are buried here in the plot for the Forgotten Ten of Mountjoy Prison. And Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan were both arrested a couple of days after Bloody Sunday, and they were tried and convicted for 2 assassinations, but in separate places. But the thing that happened was, I believe that they actually weren't involved in Bloody Sunday, and they had witnesses saying that they were in church and in different locations. And there was one soldier who was a witness in both trials, that he had witnessed both men, even though both events were occurring in different locations at the same time. But Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan were executed by hanging on the 14th of March 1921, along with 4 other men, so 6 of them killed in total. But they were hung at the same time, and I believe the other men hung that day are also buried here. And beside them is, of course, Kevin Barry, one of the most famous men executed during the War of Independence. But Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan were most likely innocent of at least attacks on Bloody Sunday that they were convicted of. But they were executed, and they were the last people to die in connection to Bloody Sunday.